Well, good evening. Well, my name is Peter Yauhiainen. I'm a professor of religion at Kirkwood Community College. Thank you for coming out tonight. Around 7 or 8 years ago, I started digging into the literature on Christian nationalism to make sense of our nation's current political environment. I especially wanted to understand how Donald J. Trump emerged as the Republican nominee and eventual president, and why so many white Christians came to support him, and why so many evangelical Christians in particular were the most strident advocates of policies that were antithetical to the Christian faith of my own upbringing. As I dug into the sociological literature, two of the names that kept popping up over and over again were Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. And I'm thrilled that one of the two of the fearsome duo is here with us tonight. Dr. Andrew Whitehead is an associate professor of sociology and director of the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. By the way, I drove by your campus last summer. One of my sons was playing in an AAU basketball tournament in Indianapolis, and we were driving by, and I asked my son, would you like to, I know some scholars here, would you like to come here to study? He said, no, they don't have a very good basketball team. So,
it's true.
They're actually pretty bad. But there's pretty good scholars over there. Dr. Whitehead is the lead author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. I highly recommend this volume if you want to understand more about Christian nationalism, along with Samuel Perry, co-author. And this book won the 2021 Distinguished Book Award for the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. His next book, American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church, was just published this past August. Dr. Whitehead is a sought-after speaker, and his research on Christian nationalism has been featured across several national outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, The New Yorker, the Washington Post, CNN Today, The Economist. I could go on and on, right? He's been interviewed on NBC News, I've seen that interview, National Public Radio, and the BBC, among others. And has also written for the Washington Post, Time Magazine, NBC News, and the Religion News Service, among other outlets. So it's just thrilling to be able to have him here tonight. The plan for this evening is for Dr. Whitehead to talk about his new book for about 20 minutes. And then I want to engage in a little bit of Q&A with him for about 10 minutes on the podium here. And then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience for the last 30 minutes to have a conversation with Dr. Whitehead. So please join me in welcoming Andrew Whitehead.
Well, thank you. For this first part, I'll just stay right here. Can everybody hear me okay with the levels? Can't hear me? I'll keep talking and then start giving me thumbs up when you can hear me okay. Everybody good so far? Okay, great. Well, I'm really looking forward to being with you all tonight. So thank you to Peter for inviting me and putting this all together, and thank you to First Presbyterian for opening up this space, and to you as well, coming out. At least it's a beautiful evening, though, with the nice, mild weather. I'm glad to be visiting you all in Iowa with this type of weather. But yeah, for this first part, I'll share just a little bit of my journey and how that intersected with my work as a sociologist. But then I really look forward to the question and answer time so that we can have a discussion. For me, studying this for over a decade now, I love being able to hear the questions. What are folks thinking about, right? How are they thinking about these things? That helps me just learn more about this topic even myself, so I look forward to that. But as Peter said, I'm a sociologist. And so I primarily work with large surveys of the American public. And I grew up in northern Indiana, in a very small town called Wakarusa. I don't know if anybody's visited northern Indiana, but it's a town of about 1,500 people, so really small. One stoplight, manufacturing and farming, that's what we did there. And this was where I started attending church, and this is where I grew up in the faith. I still identify as a Christian, albeit different now than when I grew up, but this was where I was raised. And neighbors were important, right? Community was important. You cared for people around you. So these values and beliefs were instilled in me. I worshiped alongside my teachers, the florists, electricians, right? We were all together in this community. And then I went off to Purdue University, so a rival, I guess, of Iowa in some respects, but another Big Ten school, and studied psychology and sociology. But then it was after I graduated from there, I went to Baylor University to study sociology, and that's where I got my PhD. And it was here that I started working with large surveys of the American public. And they had a survey there where, as a grad student, I was able to analyze data looking at this survey, and they asked a number of questions. And these questions that they posed to respondents had to do with whether they thought the United States is and should be a Christian nation. And I thought these were really interesting, and there were a number of them. And when we put those together, what I found over and over is that understanding whether Americans thought the U.S. should be a Christian nation really told us a lot about how they saw a number of different issues. So it wasn't just how they saw race or gender issues or sexuality or other political issues. It was all of them. It really told us a lot. And it told us a lot above and beyond how religious they were personally, so how often they attended church, or how often they read their Bible, or which religious tradition they identified with. Knowing if they believed the U.S. should be a Christian nation told us something more above and beyond all of that. And it told us something more above and beyond whether they identified politically with a particular party, whether Republican or Democrat. So the main story that I kept finding over and over was that it's not just politics and it's not just religiosity, but something about seeing the U.S. as a Christian nation was really influential for a lot of Americans. And not just those that embraced it, but also those who rejected it. So knowing if somebody said, no, the U.S. is not a Christian nation, that told us a lot too. So on this professional journey, as a sociologist, we want to find explanations for why people do what they do. And this was really telling, so I started digging into this. But along with that, I was on essentially a personal journey too. Growing up a Christian in this community, having these values and beliefs instilled in me and holding true to those, I was on a journey myself and wrestling with how these identities of being an American and being a Christian intersected, right? In what ways these values and beliefs of being a Christian might those kind of butt heads with being a good American, right? And in what moments, right, do these two things not really work together? So as I was on this personal journey, I'm studying Christian nationalism as I came to define it as a sociologist. And this, in some sense, then led to this first book that I wrote with Sam Perry. And this was where we really put together a lot of what we were finding for a broader audience. But what I was finding too as a Christian, and Peter mentioned this as he was introducing me and thinking about politics in the U.S., is we were entering a moment where understanding Christian nationalism all of a sudden seemed to become much more important, right? So why would a candidate for president be endorsed and supported by a vast majority of Christians, even though he personally doesn't align himself with a lot of the values and beliefs that I grew up with and others did? And there were good reasons that people were wrestling with this. There were some that, kind of held their nose and voted for him. Others were much more, supportive and on board with that. But what we found was that understanding this idea of a Christian nation was really influential in explaining some of that pairing. And it wasn't just in this current moment, but it had a history too. And so I started to peel back those layers. So with this current book, it kind of tells that story, both professionally, what Christian nationalism is and wrestling with that, but then also for me personally, growing up Christian, maintaining this Christian faith, but then trying to disentangle it from this idea of the U.S. as a Christian nation, where for many folks, they don't see any difference, is what I found. To be a Christian is to be a good American, and in order to be a good American, you probably need to be Christian. So trying to figure out how these things could be disentangled and in what ways. So for this current book, I really tried to explore how could I make that case? How could I help folks who, like me, are on this journey of trying to think through what it means to be Christian and be a citizen of the United States, right? In what ways do they intersect? In what ways do they not? And so to do that, it became clear to me because with my first book, some of the feedback, even from close family members, were asking me, are you still a Christian? Because I was speaking out against Christian nationalism. And so that really made it clear that in a lot of minds, right, these things are intertwined. So with this book, trying to identify, well, what is Christian nationalism? And so in our work, sorry this mic keeps moving on me. In our work, I'm just going to hold it. Does this work for everybody? Okay. So in our work, we define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework. And so cultural frameworks are collections of symbols, values, narratives, beliefs that tie together and trade upon this desire for a close fusion of a particular expression of Christianity with American civic life. And so to understand religion in the U.S., and especially Christianity, is to know that there are a lot of different expressions, right? So even in this city, we have Presbyterians, and we have Baptists, and Methodists, and Pentecostals, right? There's all these different expressions of this same Christian faith. But when we're talking about Christian nationalism, we're talking about a very particular type of Christianity that folks want to see closely intertwined with what it means to be an American. And this country, both the civil policies, the social benefits of being a citizen, being American, should flow toward these true Americans more so than anyone else. So society should be structured in such a way that those that embrace or represent this expression of Christianity are in the truest sense Americans, with others coming after. And this plays out in a lot of different ways. So one way is traditionalist social arrangements, meaning that society should be structured so that essentially the heterosexual family, nuclear family with children is the ideal, with other family units not being the ideal, right? So being denied civil rights or social benefits if they don't align with this particular type of family. Another element is a comfort with authoritarian social control. So we find over and over as we survey the American public, a comfort with setting aside the norms of democracy and the values of democracy in order to get your way. So one way this plays out is when we ask the American public their comfort with the use of political violence if an election doesn't turn out the way that they had hoped. And Americans that embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to agree that, yes, you can use political violence in the face of an election that doesn't turn out the way that you want. They're more comfortable with the idea that sometimes you need to endorse rulers who will set aside the norms of democracy in order to make things right as they see it, right? So this comfort with setting aside these values of compromise or working together, or if you lose an election, playing by the same rules and trying again next time. There's a comfort with setting that aside. And that always plays into reinforcing these traditionalist social arrangements. Again, the idea that society has a particular way it should be structured, and we need to be able to do anything we can to ensure that. And the logic here is clear, right? Because if we believe that the God of the universe says that the U.S. society should be structured in a particular way, then who are we to let democracy stand in the way, right? And so this is that comfort with authoritarian measures to enact that will. The third element is ethno-racial boundaries, meaning that the ideal American, right, social belonging, civic participation, all of these tend to fall along ethno-racial lines, such that the belief, the narrative, is that this country was created by white Anglo-Protestant men, essentially, for the benefit of white Anglo-Protestants. And those are the folks, again, who are the ideal in the vision of what the U.S. should be. And so we find over and over, when we measure this across the American public, there's a comfort with saying that ideally, the white Anglo-Protestants are at the center of culture, and racism or systemic racism or anything like that generally is not a part of our history or is not true. And so it sees the U.S. again as built by these folks and for these folks primarily. And then the last element we find over and over is a sense of populism and feeling as though this group, the true Americans, are under attack, that elites, whether it's in academia or politics or religion, are trying to take away and dilute this true American sense of this group. And this leads to a feeling of victimization and, again, persecution. And then this leads to endorsing or drawing into more conspiratorial thinking. Again, feeling as though they're under persecution and endorsing or agreeing with, more recently, QAnon conspiracy theory, other conspiracy theories, as a way to say that we need to defend our group and trading on a sense of fear of other people. So these four elements we find over and over in surveys make up and constitute this cultural framework, because the Christianity of Christian nationalism is really of a particular type, right? It isn't just historic religious beliefs, but there are these cultural, what I think and call cultural baggage that comes along with it and gets added onto it. And so it isn't just about saying something about Jesus or the divinity of Jesus, but also endorsing these other aspects of what they believe is the Christian faith that comes along with it. So with all those in place, what I explore in American idolatry then is what I think are three idols of Christian nationalism. And these are power, fear, and violence. And so power, I think, is a central idol of Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism is concerned with being able to make the social world according to its vision. And to do that, you need to have power, because power is the ability to get others to do what you want despite their resistance. And so being able to use power is central. But it's a self-interested power. It's a power to benefit the in-group, the us, the true Americans. Because, as we know, if we look back to the Civil Rights Movement, they used power, right? So the Voting Rights Act is a use of political power, but it was to benefit all Americans, right? It was to open up voting for everyone. So there are uses of power that open up civil benefits, and there are uses of power that close those off. And the power of Christian nationalism, the idol, wants to close off who gets access, right? And so that central idol is power. Now, when you have power, the thing you're most afraid of is not having power. And so fear and a sense of threat is the second idol of Christian nationalism, I argue, to where being afraid of that power being taken away, to no longer be able to benefit the in-group, is key. But to do that, you have to draw boundary lines. You need to know who to be afraid of. Because in sociology, what we find over and over is if you want to know who you are, the easiest way to do that is to know who you're not, right? If we can say we know we're not them, then we know who we are. And so fear trades on creating this outgroup and saying we're not these other folks. And so fear and a sense of threat are key, and that's a second idol, and there's a lot that goes into that. But when we create these boundary lines between us and them, predicated on fear and sense of threat of them, what we find historically over and over is that violence is a natural result. Because in any way we can, we're wanting to defend those boundary lines. And so if we're talking about race or immigration or refugees, any of that, we see over and over, violence is something that pops up when creating those boundary lines. And essentially, I think violence is an idol of Christian nationalism too, because it's taking into, for Christians, taking things into our own hands, right? Not trusting, for Christians, God to make a way, to provide, but that we have to do something to defend ourselves. And so, in the book, trying to explore these idols. And I think with this book, I'm trying to speak specifically to Americans who identify with Christianity, to try and resource them in such a way that we don't even really have to talk about Christian nationalism, although I think it's important. But if we can think about how Jesus, in his, the words in the Gospels that are recorded, or in the messages and values that we see with his life, if we can help folks think about how to handle power, or how to respond to fear and sense of threat, or how to think about violence, in these ways, then we can actively confront Christian nationalism in our midst, because it is those idols that are perpetuating much of the damage that Christian nationalism can cause people to do. And again, well-meaning folks, right? I don't doubt that the people that I grew up with who embrace Christian nationalism are not well-meaning folks, right? If I needed something and called some of those people I grew up with, they would want to come and help me. But the key is that I find over and over is that we have to ask ourselves, and this is something I ask myself, so I'm just going to put it on me and not necessarily anybody else here, but I have to ask myself, to whose benefit am I thinking of? Essentially, how broad is the we that I see myself as a part of? Right? And for many Americans like myself, who kind of grew up embracing Christian nationalism, the we was very constrained. It was very particular. But I've become more convinced myself, and I don't know if you're on a similar journey, but more convinced myself that we should be expanded. And that is part of the Christian faith. And so as I think of Christianity and disentangling it from Christian nationalism, that's the key that I keep coming back to, is how broad is the we? And who is telling me to constrain who the we is? Does it just fall along national lines, or even within the nation along gender or sexuality or race or citizenship? So as a Christian, I have to wrestle with these, really for me, but in this book, trying to invite others to wrestle with that as well. And so the key, what I hope, is that with the book, or even tonight, that the sense that we're all on a journey is clear, and that none of us have arrived. I haven't arrived. This isn't the last word, but it's a reflection of a journey that I've been on, and that we have to go on together. Both those that attend here at First Presbyterian or attend elsewhere, but as American Christians, but Christians broadly, wrestling with what does it mean to follow Christ in the midst of this culture and in this time, this historical period? And what are the ways that it's been co-opted by others to gain better access to power and seeing the world made in a particular way? So these are questions that I pose and that I'm continuing to wrestle with. But yeah, with this book, trying to explain some of that journey. So maybe we can move into the Q&A time, but then too, for us all to have a discussion, because there's a lot of research that I've been a part of, and so if there's any questions that come up, would love to share anything I can to help in that sense. But thanks for letting me talk a little bit about my journey this far.
Now, maybe you already partly answered this first question, but I'll phrase it in my way. So the Christianity that I learned while growing up stressed the importance of empathy. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, for example. And following the example of Christ by loving others, right? Even those who are very different from you. In what way does Christian nationalism seem to negate those principles?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, in the section where I was thinking about fear and sense of threat with the book, one of the key ways to confront that idol is empathy. So when we don't know those that we're being told to fear, right, we have a distorted view of those folks. So one aspect of idolatry is that it distorts our vision of God and it distorts our vision of others, right? We can't see them clearly. And fear and sense of threat, I think, play into this. And so with Christian nationalism, cutting off not just necessarily contact with the other, but maintaining a distorted view of them is key. Because it's much easier to fear something that is essentially made up, but then once we know and can see clearly, fear and sense of threat begins to turn away and go by the wayside. And empathy, I think, is one of the key ways to do that. So I talked with a friend and share some of his thoughts in the book, this road and path of empathy that we can take to where we need contact with others. And not just contact, but then allowing them to show us their lives and teach us about where they're at. And then with that, walking with them in whatever they're facing. And so in this road of empathy, we begin to know and then hopefully see clearly those that we've been told to fear and feel the sense of threat toward. And so I think with Christian nationalism as a cultural framework, it would much rather build up these visions of this group that is only coming to take away what you believe or are being told is rightfully yours, when in reality, it's anything but that. That it isn't a zero-sum game, that we can see an abundance for all. And so you'll hear things like, well, I don't hate, individual people, but they'll support policies that block those people in that group from accessing civil rights or living in peace. And so empathy, I think, is a key part of that.
Would you say that contact in local communities with people, arranging for people to have contact with others outside their comfort zone, that could be a key way of countering the impact of Christian nationalism, so that you just can't categorize them as some sort of abstraction?
Yeah, I think that is the first step, and I think it's a very important step, is gaining that access and contact. But I think it's incomplete to stop there, because one of the things that sociology teaches us and shows us is that it isn't just individual actions or individual beliefs that perpetuate our social systems, but it's those systems that can operate apart from whether anybody believes this to be true or not. So it's this idea of, you may have a bank that if we look at it across all the mortgages that they give out, and this is like true stories that happen right now today, they'll have higher mortgage interest rates for racial minorities compared to white Americans. So this isn't something that is in the past, but happens today. If we went up to all of the officers that worked there, none of them probably would be outwardly racist. But they're operating, and they're in a system that is operating according to principles that look at certain, what they believe are, objective facts about the situation, but it's always producing unequal benefits. And so it isn't just having contact with folks, although that is important in changing hearts and minds, but it's then seeing those people as part of a community and understanding the hurdles that the community faces, and then seeing, well, how can we basically work together to eliminate those hurdles for all those folks and not just this one person. So it's the difference between, some writers talk about it, a difference between charity and justice. So Christians should be involved in charity, meeting the needs of the individuals in front of them. But then we also need to think about, well, why is this one person in need? And are there others like them? And why are they all experiencing this same need? And what can we do about that? Are there ways that we can confront the system itself, right? So in the book, using the metaphor of, pulling a person out of the river, and it's great, we need to do that, pull them out of the river. But then we need to start wondering, well, what's pushing them in the river upstream? Can we go upstream and begin to fix it there? And so that's the difference between not only gaining contact with people, but then thinking about their experiences as a whole. And what can we do about that?
How would you distinguish between Christian nationalism and patriotism? And is Christian nationalism, in a certain way, more corrosive to the Christian faith than patriotism?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so a lot of political theorists will talk about it in this sense, where patriotism, we could see it as a love and an affinity for our fellow countrymen and women, right? Or the country that we're born in. But it's to an extent that it isn't over and above other countries or nations or peoples. So we don't need others to be pushed down for ourselves to be lifted up, but just an affinity for those that are around us. Whereas nationalism is wanting to elevate our group at the expense of others, and wanting to make sure that we have more in the sense that others might have less. Now, there are other Christians who would say that patriotism is just as dangerous as nationalism. I probably differ from them in that sense, where I think to be a patriot and to love our country and our people around us, in this sense, to love someone or something is to tell the truth about them, right? So I have a spouse, and if I never told her the truth, or she never told me the truth, would anybody say that's true love, right? When I'm wrong, for her to love me is to show me when I'm wrong, and the same for me to her. And so to love our country is to look at those aspects where, yes, there are wonderful aspects about being an American. I'm grateful for having been born by historical accident in this time and in this country. But I think to love this country then is to tell the truth about its history, where it has gone wrong, where it's going wrong now, in a sense that we can hopefully improve, right? And have it do better at loving the people within its borders, and especially the people outside of it. And so in that sense, I think patriotism can encompass a truth-telling and a desire for it to live up to its stated ideals, whereas nationalism is protective and would not want that, to only say that, this is the way it's always been and this is the right way. And so I think we can distinguish them in that sense.
In both of your books, you demonstrate that Christian nationalism impacts whites and blacks differently, and that in your current book, that it impacts blacks to be more accepting and open to the participation of potential outgroups. Why is that the case?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we see that empirically is that for white Americans, Christian nationalism usually inclines them towards, wanting to discount the experiences of racial and ethnic minorities. Whereas you said, for black Americans, believing the U.S. as a Christian nation inclines them towards wanting to broaden, for racial and ethnic minorities, the benefits that they can acquire or have access to. And the reason we see this to be the case is that for white Americans and black Americans, they essentially have lived and grown in different social locations. So the histories that they've been a part of are so distinctly different. So for black Americans to believe the U.S. is a Christian nation, because of their experiences in this country, are essentially saying, well, then it should live up to those Christian ideals of love and justice and mercy and the benefit for all. So Frederick Douglass has some famous quotes, and Martin Luther King Jr. could be seen as inheriting that mantle as well, where essentially from the position of their Christian faith, these men were saying, calling America to account, that if it is Christian, then it should be living to these better ideals than it has. But for white Americans, because the experience in this country has largely been one of, again, not for everyone, but as we look as a group, white Americans have 10 times the wealth as black and Hispanic Americans. They tend to do better as a group. And so when we see that, their experiences have been one where this idea of a Christian nation is one where they should continue to benefit from this inequality. And so either ignoring it or perpetuating it is just a part of that cultural framework. And again, it isn't as though these are individuals who are actively trying to do that, but essentially by maintaining the status quo, it allows the country to continue to operate as it always has, which again was to the benefit from the earliest days, white Americans as a group. And so that's a part of that history too that I think we have to wrestle with. It's a part of, I think, telling the truth about where we're at and why.
It seems like what the polls might be capturing there in your description of black Americans versus white Americans is maybe they're capturing among black Americans a sense of civil religion where you're drawing upon the prophetic tradition and living up to the ideals of the founding, right? And you know, because Martin Luther King Jr., I would say, you know, practiced a kind of civil religion, right? Calling Americans to live up to the American creed, right? Whereas maybe the polling is capturing among a lot of white Americans more of a nationalism, but among black Americans, maybe it's more of the civic sense of religion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think about it and talk about it. Having a shared sense for Americans of shared values and realities, I think is important. But we know because of their experiences, they're interpreting those questions differently, and I think along those lines.
Well, I want to open it up for questions from the audience, so I'm going to stroll through the aisle here, and if you want to raise a hand, I see one.
Hello, thank you for coming this evening. During your research, have you found any difference in age groups and their views on Christian nationalism or their kind of ability to be radicalized? Are they more susceptible, kind of like through generational ties and different, you know, upbringings and societal norms?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do find differences by age. So when we're just looking across age brackets, Americans that are at the upper end, so strongly embracing Christian nationalism, tend to be significantly older in their mean age than any of the other groups. So ambassadors are those that strongly embrace it. Accommodators are Americans that are kind of sympathetic to it. They tend to be a little younger. Then resistors, and then rejectors. And it really is a linear trend. So younger folks tend to have lower levels of Christian nationalism than older folks. But there's a number of interesting things that come out of this. So we'll have to keep serving, because it could be, as you get older, are you more likely to then start embracing Christian nationalism? Based on social location, right? Folks just are in different places as they age and have worked and, you know, all that. We find that can be the case. So we're not sure yet. We just don't know. We don't have data in a long enough history to tell that. Or is this something where cohort replacement will take place, where younger folks are less likely to strongly embrace Christian nationalism, and as they age, they basically maintain that level? And so are we going to see the number of Americans that strongly embrace it continue to shrink? That could happen too. Likely, usually with social science, the answer is both and it's complicated, so we'll probably see a little bit of both. But just in the last 10 to 15 years, we do see the ambassadors, the ones that strongly embrace Christian nationalism, that group is shrinking just slightly. It is getting a little bit smaller. So it isn't as though it's spreading. And so the age differences are real and pronounced. It really is a linear trend. But yeah, great question. Yeah.
Our new Speaker of the House is a Christian nationalist. What effect is that going to have on our body politic?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So with Sam Perry, we wrote a column in Time laying out exactly the evidence of Mike Johnson in what he's written and spoken, embracing those different elements of Christian nationalism that I shared. And I think the effect is real in a number of different senses. So one is with Christian nationalism being at the center of power of the Republican Party as it's constituted right now, because they don't have the Senate or the presidency, but the U.S. House. And so he really is the ranking most powerful Republican in D.C. And the fact that he embraces Christian nationalism, maybe not as a label, but when we look at what it is and what he's written, we know that he aligns with all of it. I think it shows that he is now the center of the party, and Christian nationalism in that sense is acceptable as a representation of the center of the party. So the legislation that he brings to the floor and allows to be voted on, or the legislation that he does not allow, are going to align with that vision of what he would see the U.S. should be like, what he believes the Christian God has commanded the U.S. to look like. And so it isn't only in the functioning of the U.S. House, but one thing that we've tracked since Trump won the presidency and then after is that the proliferation of Christian nationalism within our body politic and rhetoric is really important too. In basically mainstreaming some of those views brings it to the fore. And in some ways that's good, so everybody can know exactly what's at stake. But two, it can normalize it as well. And so we'll see and have battles around, well, is this really who we are as a country or what we want it to be? And so I think in the end, that's positive. It brings it out into the open. But I think too, the embrace of the big lie and election denialism and embrace of authoritarian tactics, of setting aside fair and free election results, or the desire to want to set those aside, I think those are real threats, especially in that seat. And so over the next year, I think it is something that I want all Americans to be aware of and wrestle with, because that is a very real threat to what we would want the U.S. to look like. Because in his view, it isn't a democracy. And he said, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. And a republic, the virtuous rule. But in his view, who's truly virtuous, right? Who has the privilege of participating in democracy? It's folks that align with his vision for the United States. And so I think that's the real threat, is just being aware of that. But, really wonderful journalists and other scholars and academics are trying to bring all these things to light. And I think in a sense, that's a positive as well. Learning more about this and being aware of what's at stake really over the next year and into the next election too, I think is key.
Thank you for the work that you are doing. You write about power and fear, violence. It seems to me there's some frighteningly parallels with the rise of Hitler and Nazism. Am I off base there?
Well, I think, as we look at, so when I study Christian nationalism in the U.S., right, it's a form of religious nationalism. There's nothing unique about religious nationalism coming to the fore in the United States, right? So throughout history, many countries or empires, religious nationalism has risen up. And even across the globe today, in other countries, majority religions, other world religions, are at the forefront and kind of are a part of the religious nationalism in that country, whether it's Hindu nationalism in India or Islamic nationalism in majority Muslim countries in some places. So in that sense, there's nothing unique about Christian nationalism here. And as we look at history in Germany, again, there's nothing unique about religious nationalism coming to the fore there. And so again, those idols of power, fear, and violence, a comfort with authoritarian social control, a fear of a declining country and a cultural heritage being taken away. There are echoes of that, whether it's in Germany in the 30s and 40s, or countries around the world today, or even further back. Those are the same stories being told. So the more that we can learn from our history, especially where we see democracies slide and disappear, I think that's really important. So a really wonderful book, How Democracies Die. That's one that's been influential to me to think through the guardrails of democracy, and they compare the U.S. to other countries. And when we kind of slide into authoritarianism, what are the mechanisms that cause that to take place? And religious nationalism is a part of that. And so being aware of it here, learning from our history and other countries, I think is very important.
Thank you for doing the work you do. I agree. So when and why did you decide to frame the issue as Christian nationalism as opposed to white Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, in the book, actually, in my language here tonight, I've just used Christian nationalism, as you point out. But it really is a white Christian nationalism. And so I try to lay that point out in the book clearly, and I go back and forth between the two terms, because when we're talking about Christian nationalism, those ethno-racial boundaries are a key part of it. Because from the very beginning, it really was focused on, and as we saw Christianity come to these shores, it was operating alongside the creation of these racial categories. And so Christianity and Christian nationalism in the U.S. was created and perpetuated within white Christian institutions primarily. Even though it has diffused across the population, it was primarily created and perpetuated in those. And so it really is a white Christian nationalism in the sense that white institutional Christianity created it and created those boundary lines that fell along ethno-racial lines. And then empirically, we see that over and over it's associated with very distinct views that elevate white Americans and racial and ethnic minorities then are lowered in that sense, whether viewed as inherently more criminal or not able to work as hard or not as smart as or whatever else. And then our history itself. So the folks that brought Christianity to these shores over and over, it was associated with, again, the subjugation of black bodies or the pushing of indigenous populations off the land or violence towards them. And so, again, those categories of black and brown skin color were associated with heathen, and white and Christian was associated with good and upstanding. And so from our earliest history, that's a part of it. So yeah, in my language tonight, I didn't highlight the white Christian nationalism part, but that is a key part of it historically. And I want to say too, that is separate as well from white nationalists. There's overlap of those kind of circles, but they aren't one and the same. And so being aware of that too, I think, is key. But I thank you for raising that, and that's a very important part of the story. Yeah.
I think the remark is attributed to Soren Kierkegaard that only individuals can be Christians, that nations can't be Christian. What would you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think it kind of raises a very good discussion point, right, of what's the function of a nation, and then how does that overlap with Christianity, and in what ways can those work together, or in what ways are they fundamentally going to have to be separated? And one of the influential books for me along my journey was The Myth of a Christian Nation by Greg Boyd. He's a pastor in Minnesota. And he talked about how he kind of uses the empires and kingdoms of the world, they operate according to particular principles. Whereas the kingdom of God fundamentally operates according to a very different principle. So kingdoms of this world operate according to a principle of power over other people. And that's how nations have to operate, right? Through the threat of violence, essentially keeping everyone in line. Whereas the kingdom of God does not operate according to a threat of violence, but of service and sacrifice, power under others. And so he makes the case, and in my journey I found it to be compelling, and it still is compelling to me. It's this idea that fundamentally the kingdom of God can't be overlapped with a nation and how it operates. And so in some way there's going to be part of, for me, again, I'm speaking for myself, where being a Christian is going to put me at odds at some points with whatever nation I'm a part of or empire I'm a part of, because I'm convinced that violence toward fellow countrymen and women, or those who are not fellow countrymen or women, is never within the purview of the Christian faith. But that doesn't make me a good citizen then, if the nation is calling me to enact that. And so again, living that out, that's a whole journey, that's difficult too. But those are the things that I'm wrestling with. So I think the underlying thought to that quote, I think for me, resonates, and maybe it does for you too. Yeah.
If I could interject. So in your book, you define, and you've mentioned it here tonight, Christian nationalism being a comfort with an authoritarian social control. To what degree is it a comfort with, or to what degree is it an authoritarian framework, and not simply a comfort with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple ways that I could talk about it. So one is statistically. So if I'm trying to predict a particular attitude, even if it's political violence, right, a comfort with political violence, there's a selection of questions that have been shown to measure authoritarianism, right? And so when we put those together and we put them in a statistical model that also is measuring Christian nationalism, what we find is that the authoritarian measures don't fully account for the influence of Christian nationalism. So what that's telling us is that Christian nationalism is explaining something above and beyond just authoritarianism, although they are tightly linked together. So again, there's something about this vision of the U.S. should be Christian distinctly that carries with it authoritarian tendencies and measures, or aspects of it, but isn't just authoritarianism writ large. And I think it has to do with, again, those narratives of a Christian nation, the legitimating that in the sacred, rather than just, this is the way that society has to work. And so they're tightly intertwined, but we try to make the case that they are still separate empirically and conceptually. And so that's the way that I'm usually thinking about it.
Do your surveys or studies reflect anything about economic class and the impact?
Yeah, that's a really great question too. We tend to find we don't tend to find really distinct differences across income specifically. Education as a measure of social class, that tends to be pretty distinct, where Americans with higher levels of education tend to have lower levels of Christian nationalism. But it almost is a U-shape. It isn't a perfect linear trend like age. And so a lot of times what we find is these things kind of working in concert with politics and religion, socioeconomic class. They all kind of intertwine. And so it isn't just an economic explanation, although that can be a part. But what we find over and over is that the rhetoric and cultural framework of Christian nationalism is useful to those who maybe have lower economic standing or higher economic standing, but for different reasons. And so for those on lower economic scales or social class, the idea of a Christian nation brings kind of a sense of power and a part of the group and winning. Whereas those at the upper end, it's actually kind of a way to make sense of why they're at the upper end, right? And that this is a nation that was made for them and by them. And there's a great book we talked about at dinner, Kevin Kruse, One Nation Under God, where he talks about how corporate America created a Christian America, where it was very rich folks in the 20s who were afraid of what they saw as creeping socialism, saying, we need to really highlight this idea of this is a Christian America and Christians are capitalists. And look, we're capitalists. And so that's how God wants it to operate. And so that's a key part. So even at different ends of the economic spectrum, the cultural framework is useful, but for different reasons, which is pretty fascinating too.
Is there evidence from the data that certain religious groups that identify with Christian nationalism are more prone to support violence than others? I'm thinking about all the language about spiritual warfare, and and it seems like there's been this surge of like Pentecostal supporters for these kinds of activities. Do you see any of that in the data, where there are certain subcategories of evangelicals that are more prone to this violence than others?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I do think there are, if we just look across religious traditions, more evangelical Protestants are embracing political violence or have a comfort with it than other groups. Now, whether that intersects with Christian nationalism, I don't know. We could look at it, and I don't know of any evidence right now that evangelicals who embrace Christian nationalism are more likely than others. But that's something that we could look into for sure. But I think some of the reason why we might find more conservative religious folks embracing it is probably due to Christian nationalism, among other things. But yeah, I don't know of a study yet that looks at that intersection specifically yet.
What does the future hold? Are you hopeful? Are you concerned about next year? You talked about the slight decline in the ambassadors, right? Is there any evidence that as more attention is paid to this theme of Christian nationalism, that more Americans don't want to go there, or is there evidence that maybe they do want it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think that I do have concern for democracy in the U.S. based on what we saw on January 6th, and then, Trump is still a leading candidate for the Republican nomination, and in 2016, he would, said that he would have to see the results to know if he would want to abide by the results. And the same was in 2020, and it'll be the same in 2024. And so as an American who wants to live in a pluralistic democratic society, I don't care if it's a Republican or Democrat, that type of language should be disqualifying. And so that, I'm still afraid of that. And so I don't think, we should underplay the threat there. I think it is real. Now, whether I'm hopeful, I do think, in conversations like these that different religious groups are having or different groups are having, I think it is important. Because I think for those of us who maybe sense this fear or say that, I'm a Christian, but this expression of Christianity doesn't align with what I believe to be true, the more that we can speak up and make that known, the more that we're able to show that this is a very particular expression that is very focused on a very particular vision for the country that we know in polling does not align with a majority of Americans or even Christians. But when we stay kind of quiet, it makes it sound like we are all in tacit agreement with this. And so I think the more that we can speak up, the more that the light gets shined. I think that is important, and I think that's a good thing. And so that will continue to happen. But I do think over the next year, and we're about exactly a year from Election Day. I think we're 365 days away right today from Election Day. And you all have caucuses in January, right? So it's coming. And the new poll that was just released, there's a lot that's going to happen between now and a year from now. But I think, the more that we can have our eyes open and do what we can in our communities and not necessarily raise our voice to try to convert everyone around us, but to at least raise the questions that cause people to think twice about, well, what do you mean by a Christian nation? What do you mean that this nation is Christian? Or when Mike Johnson says, just pick up the Bible and you'll know what I believe. Well, what version of the Bible? What translation? What parts? right? Raising those questions, because I think quickly it becomes clear that those are just kind of essentially kind of code words for this broader understanding of, well, I want the world in the U.S. to operate according to this belief. And that's all that cultural baggage that gets brought along with Christian nationalism. So the more that we can draw that out and create opportunities for conversation and raising the question, I think that that'll play an important role for folks wherever they're at on their journey. Because I've been at different points too, and I needed those moments of reflection. Well, if we were a Christian nation, why did we enslave humans? Why did we push indigenous people off their lands? Right? And those are key moments. So, yeah, I think that gives me hope. And young people, the age question I think is important. Being on college campuses and them wrestling with these things at earlier ages is, I think, a sign of hope as well. So, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us here tonight. It's just been such a great privilege to have. Please join me in Now, I do want to put in a plug. We want to support our local bookstore. Next Page Books is out in the fellowship area. And Bart from Next Page Books ordered several copies of Andrew's book. And so I would encourage you to pick up a copy, and Andrew will do a book signing afterwards. And I have one other announcement. He will be on the Kirkwood campus tomorrow at 11:15 in Ballantyne Auditorium with a more formal presentation in PowerPoint on the ongoing threat of white Christian nationalism to American democracy. So that's open to the public, and we hope to get a good mix of young people and older people and faculty and just lots of people there to hear his talk. So I encourage you to come to Kirkwood tomorrow morning. It should be a beautiful morning, 11:15 in Ballantyne Auditorium. So thank you once again.